11th grade lit, and we're starting on page 95 of Heart of Darkness. Question number 23, we don't know what that is yet. He just found a hut with, a note. It's kind of a warning, be cautious. It had wood to be burned for the ship, and so somebody is expecting them. We don't know who that is. And so I will start. The current was more rapid now. The steamer at her last gasp. The stern wheel flopped languidly, and I caught myself listening on tiptoe for the next beat of the boat. For in sober truth, I expected the wretched thing to give up every moment. It was like watching the last flickers of a life. But still we crawled. Remember on page 90 we talked about the metaphor of crawling. Animals crawl, people crawl if they're extremely subservient to somebody else. So he said, sometimes I would pick out a tree a little way ahead to measure our progress toward Kurtz. Is the reason why they're out there, to get Kurtz. But I lost it invariably before we got abreast. To keep the eye so long on one thing was too much for human patience. The manager displayed a beautiful resignation. I fretted and fumed and took to arguing with myself whether or no I would talk openly with Kurt. But before I could come to any conclusion, it occurred to me that my speech or my silence, indeed any action of mine, would be mere futility. What did it matter what anyone knew or ignored? What did it matter who was manager? One gets sometimes in a flash of insight. The essentials of this affair lay deep under the surface, beyond my reach and beyond my power of meddling. The last time we looked, they were 50 miles from Kurtz. The next paragraph, they're 8 miles from Kurtz. So they've covered 42 miles since the last time, and things are getting a little fuzzy. So Tucker, would you read, and this is a long paragraph, you don't have to read it all. It goes over the next, you can read some of it and then pass it on. Page 95, bottom of the page.
It was the evening of the second day. We judged ourselves about 8 miles from Kurtz's station. I wanted to push on, but the manager looked grave and told me the navigation was so dangerous that it would be advisable, the sun being very low already, to wait where we were until next week. Moreover, he pointed out that if the warning to approach cautiously were to be followed, we must approach in daylight.
Just make a note somewhere that it's 8 miles. Just to remind you of where you are in the book. He was 50, started out at 800 at the central station, but he's made a lot of good time. Now he's 50, now he's 8, and he gets even closer. You can keep reading.
This was sensible enough. 8 miles meant nearly 3 hours streaming for us. And I could also see suspicious ripples at the upper end of the beach. Nevertheless, I was annoyed beyond expression at the delay, most unreasonably too, since one night more did not matter much after 7 months. As we had plenty of wood and caution was the word, I brought up in the middle of the stream. The breach was narrow, straight, with high sides like a railway cutting. The dust came gliding into it long before the sun had set. The current ran smooth and swift, but a dumb immobility sat on the banks. The living trees, lashed together by the creepers, every little bush of the undergrowth, might have been changed into stem, even to the slenderest twig, to the slightest leaf. It was not sleep. It seemed unnatural, like a bit of trains, like a state of trains. Not the faintest sound of any kind could be heard. At best.
Yeah, would you, Alistair? You looked on amazed.
You looked on amazed and began to suspect yourself being deaf, and the night came suddenly and struck you the rent as well. About 3 in the morning, some large fish leaped. A loud splash made me jump as though a gun had been fired. In the sun rose, there was a white ball, very warm and flaming, more blinding than the night. It did not shift or dry, it was just there, standing all around you like something solid. At 8 or 9, perhaps, it lifted as a shutter lifts. You had a glimpse of the towering multitude of trees, the immense matted jungle with the blazing little ball of the sun hanging over it, all perfectly still. And then the white shutter came down again, smoothly, as if sliding in greased grooves. I uttered
Hey, look at question number 23. How did Marlowe describe the noise that came coming out of the fog the next morning?
Something that just set you on edge.
Yes, but what, yeah? Did you have something, Robert?
Oh, no, I was just saying, if you want me to read it.
Well, yeah, look at the words desolation, cry, complaining, mournful. I think the common denominator there is sad. It's a noise of sadness, of complaining, of mourning. They're going to, who do you think it might be about? Like, why are they out there? Why is the ship going up?
To find the station, I guess.
Because who's in the station they want? Kurtz. And what do they know about Kurtz's health? He's sick. So they're gonna figure out, maybe this has something to do with Kurtz. We'll find out. So we'll go to probably.
I went forward and ordered the chain to be hauled in the shore, so it has to be ready to trip the anchor and move the steam back once it's necessary. Will they attack? Whispered all voice. Will we be all butchered? It's called another. But faces twitched the strain, trembled slightly, the eyes forgot to meet. It was very curious to see the contrast of expressions of the white men and the black fellow of our group, who were as much strangers to that part of the river as we, though their homes were only 800 miles away. The white, of course, greatly distant or discomposed, had besides a curious look of being painfully shocked by such an outrageous ruin. The others had an alert, naturally interested expression, but their faces were essentially quiet, even those of the one or two who grinned as they hauled at the chain. Several exchanged short, melting phrases which seemed to settle the matter to their satisfaction. Their headman, a young, broad-chested black, severely draped in dark blue French clothes with fierce nostrils and his hair all done up artfully in oil wrinkles, stood near me. Aha, I said, just for good fellowship's sake, catch him. He snapped into the fellowship weapon, widening of his eyes, a flash of sharp blue. Catch him, give him to us. Anyway, I asked, what would you do? Eat him, he said, curtly, and leaning his elbow on the rail, looked out into the fog in a dignified and profoundly pensive attitude. I would no doubt have been promptly horrified, had it not occurred to me that he and his chaps must be very hungry, that they must have been growling increasingly hungry for at least this month past. They had been engaged for 6 months. I don't think a single one of them had any clear idea of time as we at the end of the countless ages had. They still belonged to the beginnings of time, had no inherited experience to teach them, as it were. And of course, as long as there was a piece of paper written over in accordance with some martial law or other made down the river, it didn't enter anybody's head to trouble how they would live. Can I stop there?
Yeah.
Certainly they had brought with them some rotten hippo meat, which couldn't have lasted very long anyway, even if the pilgrims had, in the midst of a shocking hullabaloo, thrown a considerable quantity of it overboard. It looked like a high-handed proceeding, but it was really a case of legitimate self-defense. You can't breed dead hippo waking, sleeping, eating, and at the same time keep your precarious grip on existence. Besides that, they had given them every week 3 pieces of brass wire, each about 9 inches long. The theory was they were to buy their provisions with that currency in riverside villages. You can see how that worked. There were either no villages where the people were hostile, or the director, who like the rest of us fed out of tins, with an occasional old he-goat thrown in. Didn't want to stop the steamer for some more or less fecunded reason. So itself, made loops of it to snare the fishes with, I don't see what good their extravagant salary could be to them. I must say, it was paid with a regularity worthy of a large and honorable trading company. For the rest, the only thing to eat, though it didn't look eatable in the least, I saw in their possession was a few lumps of some stuff like half-cooked dough of a dirty lavender color. They kept wrapped in leaves, and now and then swallowed a piece of it, but so small that it seemed done more for the looks of the thing than for any serious purpose of sustenance. Why, in the name of all the gnawing devils of the hungry, they didn't go for us. They were 30 to 5, and have a good tuck interval. It amazes me now when I think of it. They were big, powerful men with not much capacity to weigh the consequences with courage, with strength. Even yet, though their skins were no longer glossy and their muscles no longer hard, and I saw that something restraining one of those human secrets that baffle probability had come into play.
Yes.
I looked at them with a swift quickening of interest, not because it occurred to me I might be eaten by them before very long, though I own to you that just then I perceived in a new light, as it were, how unwholesome the pilgrims looked, and I hoped, yes, I positively hoped, that my aspect was not so, what shall I say, so unappetizing, a touch of fantastic vanity which fitted well with the dream sensation that pervaded all my days at the time. Perhaps I had a little fever too. One can't live with one's finger everlastingly on one's pulse. I had often a little fever, or little touch of other things, the playful paw strokes of the wilderness, the preliminary trifling before the more serious onslaught, which came in due course. Yes, I looked at them as you would on any human being, with the curiosity of their impulses, motives, capacities, weaknesses, when brought to the test of inexorable physical necessity, restraint, what possible restraint? What is superstition, disgust, patience, fear, or some kind of primitive honor? No fear can stand up to hunger. No patience can wear it out. Disgust simply does not exist where hunger is. And as to superstition, beliefs in what you may call principles, they are less than chaff in a breeze. Don't you know the devilry of lingering starvation? Its exasperating torment, its black thoughts, somber and brooding ferocity. Well, I do. It takes a man all his inborn strength to fight hunger properly. It's really easier to face bereavement, dishonor, and the prediction of one's soul than this kind of prolonged hunger, sad but true, and these chaps too had no earthly reason for any kind of scruple. Restraint, I would just as soon have expected restraint from a hyena prowling amongst the corpses of a battlefield. But there was the fact facing me, the fact dazzling to be seen, like the foam on the depths of the sea, like a ripple on an unfathomable enigma, a mystery greater. When I thought of it, then the curious, inexplicable note of desperate grief in this savage clamor that had swept by us on the riverbank, behind the blank whiteness of the plain.
All right, look at question number 24. Spends a couple pages talking about restraint. What restraint does the Marlowe's crew exhibit?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, what is question number 24? What restraint do they exhibit? Don't forget who they are. What is the crew?
The cannibals.
Cannibals. So what restraint have they exhibited?
From eating the people coming over.
Yeah, they haven't eaten them. And he said they're hungry. And you can resist a lot of desires, if you want to put it that way. But he says it's impossible to resist hunger. To resist hunger. You will do anything. That's why people end up, in these situations where they eat somebody, one of the dead corpses. You can't imagine doing that. But apparently it does lead people to do things like that. And so these guys, you'll notice the contrast. The Pilgrims and the Europeans on board the ship, they have very little restraint. There's going to be a battle here in a minute, and the Pilgrims show very little restraint. They're the Europeans. The Africans, who are starving, cannibals, they show lots of restraint. It raises the question, who's really civilized here? Is it the cannibals, or is it the Europeans? It does, in the heart of darkness, things get flipped around a little bit. Lillian.
Two pilgrims were quarreling, and hurried whispers
101, I did not think they would attack.
I did not think they would attack for several obvious reasons. The thick fog was one. If they left the bank in their canoes, they would get lost in it, as we would be if we attempted to move. Still, I had also judged the jungle of both things quite impenetrable, and yet eyes were in it, yet eyes that had seen us. The riverside bushes were certainly very thick, but the undergrowth behind was evidently penetrable. However, during the short lift, I had seen no canoes anywhere in the reach. Certainly not abreast of the steamer. But what made the idea of attack inconceivable to me was the nature of the noise, of the cries we had heard. They had not the fierce character bottom of immediate hostile intention, unexpected, wild, and violent as they had been. They had given me irresistible impression of sorrow. The glimpse of the steamboat had for some reason filled those savages with our proximity to a great human passion, but was
Alright,
even
you left out a line, it says, fill those savages with unrestrained grief.
The glimpse of the steamboat had for some reason filled the savages with unrestrained grief. The danger, if any, I expounded thus from our proximity to a great human passion let loose. Even extreme grief may ultimately vent itself in violence, but more generally takes the form of apathy.
Thanks.
Apathy.
You should have seen the pilgrims stare. They had no heart to grant or even to revile me. But I believe they thought me gone mad, with right maybe. I delivered a regular lecture, my dear boys. It was no good bothering. Keep a lookout? Well, you may guess I watched the fog for the signs of living as a cat watches a mouse. But for anything else, our eyes were of no more use to us than if we had been buried miles deep in a heap of cotton wool. It felt like it too, choking, warm, stifling. Besides, all I said, though it sounded extravagant, it was absolutely true to fact. What we afterwards alluded to as an attack was really an attempt at repulse. The action was very far from being aggressive. It was not even defensive in the usual sense. It was undertaken under the stress of desperation, and in its essence was purely protective.
Yeah, Julie.
It developed itself.
Yeah.
It developed itself, I should say, 2 hours after the fog lifted, and its commencement was at a spot, roughly speaking, about a mile and a half below Curtis Station.
So circle that, now they've gone from 50 to 8, now to a mile and a half, they're a mile and a half from Curtis. We have 47 pages left, we still haven't seen Curtis. Still haven't seen.
Oh, yeah.
We had just floundered and flopped around the bend when I saw an islet, a mere grassy hummock of bright green in the middle of the stream. It was the only thing of the kind, but as we opened the reach more, I perceived it was the head of a long sandbank, or rather a chain of shallow patches stretching down the middle of the river. They were discolored just a wash, and the whole lot was seen just under the water, exactly as a man's backbone was seen running down the middle of his back under the skin. Now, as far as I did see, I could go to the right or to the left of this. I didn't know either channel, of course. The banks looked pretty well alike. The depth appeared the
forend, yeah.
forend and the machinery right astern. Over the hole, there was a light roof supported on
Stanchion.
stanchions. The funnel projected through the roof, and in front of the funnel, a small cabin built of little planks served from a pilot house. It contained a couch, 2 camp stools, a loaded martini Henry leaning in one corner, a tiny table and the steering wheel. It had a wide door in front and a broad shutter at each side. All these were always thrown open, of course. I spent my days perched up there on the extreme fore end of that roof, before the door. At night I slept, or tried to, on the couch.
Athletic.
An athletic black belonging to some coastal tribe and educated by my poor
Predecessor.
predecessor, was the helmsman. He sported a pair of brass earrings, wore a blue cloth wrapped from the waist to the ankle, and thought all the world of himself. He was the most unstable kind of fool I'd ever seen. He steered with no end of a swagger while you were by. If we lost sight of you, he became instantly the prey of an abject funk, and would let that cripple of his steamboat get the upper hand of him in a minute.
Well, would you read to the bottom? Payne.
I was looking down at the sounding pole and feeling much annoyed to see at each try a little more of it stick out of that river. When I saw my poleman give up the business suddenly and stretch himself flat on the deck without even taking the trouble to haul his pole in, he kept hold on it though, and it trailed in the water. At the same time, the fireman, whom I could also see below me, sat down abruptly before his furnace and ducked his head. I was amazed. Then I had to look at the river mighty quick, because there was a snag in the fairway. Little sticks were flying about thick. They were whizzing before my nose, dropping below me, striking behind me against my pilot house. All this time, the river, the shore, the woods were very quiet, perfectly quiet.
Yeah, I can pick it up here. Right at the top base, the attack. They've been waiting for this. They're 1.5 miles from Kurtz. The river is more narrow. There was a sandbank. He had to go one side or to the left. He went to the west, whichever side that was. And he discovered that all of a sudden 2 of his crewmen keeled over. They died. They were struck by these arrows. He said they're like little sticks. It doesn't sound very serious, but it said I could hear the heavy splashing thump of the stern wheel and the patter of these things. We cleared the snag clumsily. Arrows, by Jove, we were being shot at. I stepped in quickly to close the shutter on the land side. That fool helmsman, with his hand on the spokes, was lifting his knees high, stamping his feet, champing his mouth like a reined horse. Confound him, and we were staggering within 10 feet of the bank. I had to lean about in order to swing the heavy shutter, and I saw a face among the leaves on the level with my own, looking at me very fierce and steady. And then suddenly, as though a veil had been removed from my eyes, I made out a deep tangled gloom, naked breast, arms, legs, glaring eyes. The bush was swarming with human limbs in motion. The bush was swarming with human limbs, glistening of bronze color. The twigs shook, swayed, rustled. The arrows flew out of them, and then the shutter came to. Steer her straight, I said to the helmsman. He held his head straight forward, his eyes rolled. He kept on lifting and setting down his feet gently. His mouth foamed a little. Keep quiet, I said in a fury. I might have just ordered a tree not to sway in the wind. I darted out. Below me there was a great scuffle of feet on the iron deck, confused exclamations, a voice screamed. Can you turn back? I caught sight of a V-shaped ripple in the water ahead. What? Another snag? A fusillade? Burst out under my feet. The pilgrims had opened with their Winchesters, were simply squirting lead into that bush. And I told you they were undisciplined, and here they are showing no restraint. A deuce of a lot of smoke came up and drove slowly forward. I swore at it. Now I could see the ripple of the snag either. I couldn't see it. I stood in the doorway peering, and the arrows came swarming. They might have been poisoned, but they looked as though they wouldn't kill a cat. The bush began to howl. Our woodcutters raised a warlike whoop. The report of a rifle just at my back deafened me. I glanced over my shoulder, and the pilot house was yet full of noise and smoke when I made a dash at the wheel. The fool had drowned everything to throw the shutter open, had dropped everything to throw the shutter and let off that martini Henry. He stood before the wide opening, glaring, and I yelled back at him to come back while I straightened the sudden twist out of that steamboat. There was no room to turn, even if I'd wanted to. The snag was somewhere very near ahead, and that confounded the smoke. There was no time to lose, so I just crowded her into the bank, right into the bank where I knew the water was deep. I'm going to stop there. Just make a note. That's 105. So I'm going to I have a few notes I want to finish giving you from Friday. So we have 40 pages to go, about 45. We can do this. I'm going to ask you to get your notes out, and we'll just finish up with this. We've got about 10 minutes. Hey, Penny, you might get those lights. Thank you. All right, so we were talking about, we're going to read as soon as we can get closer to the end of this book. We're going to read Tennyson. We're giving you some notes on Tennyson. And so here they are. Tennyson is considered one of England's greatest poets. And we had done this, yeah. All right, so these are the things I really want you to remember. This might help you in the future. These kind of things I could ask you on the exam. What is Tennyson's poem? We're going to read two poems by Tennyson. And his poetry, you need this, so make sure you write it down, is characterized by richness, abundance of his imagination. He had a great imagination. His characters were like ideals, like the Charge of Light Brigade is about these incredibly brave cavalrymen in a war. Ulysses is about Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. So they were ideal. The story and the mood always go together. They had vivid descriptions, variety of lyrical measures, words, cadences, an elevated habit of thought. This is the most important ones, the ideal characters and the elevated habit of thought. Tennyson is the kind of person you would read at a graduation or some important coronation or something. His poetry is very formal and elevated, and the ideas are elevated, and so I like him. There's one more page of this, and I've got two other authors we'll quickly look at. We're going to do poetry by all three of them eventually. I may have mentioned this at the beginning, we only 4 more, well, in 10 minutes, there'll be only 3 more Mondays left. That's how close we are. And really, 2 weeks from tomorrow is the last day we can give tests. So after 2 weeks from tomorrow, it'll definitely be exam review for the end. We can do, we could go over new stuff, but it's really time to review. So we really have 2 more weeks of regular classes. Seniors are gone after this week. And don't you have your senior thesis on Friday? Or maybe
Yes.
not?
Yeah, we're doing our senior
Sorry.
thesis.
Yeah, senior thesis is next week. Your thesis is Friday, right?
Starting Friday.
You're not all gonna go. You're doing it in the forum?
We're in.
Okay. How many people can go per day?
3.
All right, it's gonna take a while. All right, can I go on? All right. All right, so one more slide about the characteristics. He was a hard worker. He was known for his craftsmanship. He just didn't throw things together. Relevance, whatever the subject matter, he addressed the timeless human questions about identity and authority from a spiritual, psychological perspective. So he was concerned about the big issues of life, spiritual issues. And though he also enjoyed experimenting with verse and subject matter. This is Tennyson. Elevated thought. He wrote poetry into his 80s. Poet laureate. He's a duke. He's a baron. Lord Tennyson. And he wrote about the universal issues of man. Which brings us to, I think the next one is going to be Robert Browning or his wife. Let me see. Here's just some, you don't have to write this down, but these are some collections of his poetry. You'll be more interested in his individual poems. All right, so Robert Browning is next.
Mr. Powell, can we
Yeah.
go back to that last slide
Sure.
with Tennyson?
You recognize anything?
No, next one, or one before that. Just need the last, yeah.
All right, so, Ben, are you getting this? It doesn't look like it.
Yeah, get it.
All right, Robert Browning, just some background to him. He had a happy childhood. He grew up, he read a lot. Most of the great writers didn't have a lot of formal education. Those are the guys that people who now get formal educations read. They're geniuses. They don't need to go to college. There are not too many of those. They're the ones who write the books that people study in college. And so he was one of those guys. He had very little formal education, but he was a voracious reader. By age 14, that would be 9th grade, he had read the complete works of Shelley. Mary Shelley's husband, the great romantic writer. Foundation of his massive erudition was his home in London with its serenity and 6,000 volumes. Again, you may not be a reader right now, but I promise you one day when you have a family, when you marry and have a family, you're gonna want your children to read. Because you didn't, you want them to. And they'll say, well, Dad, or Mom, you'll say, it's really important, I wish I had read more. Well, you're still that, you're not a kid anymore, but you're still young enough for that to make a difference. They tell me successful people, even in the business world, read a lot. They spend some of these great entrepreneurs that you know about, spend most of their time reading. Now, they're not reading Tennyson, they're not reading Browning, but they are reading. They're in their field, or business, or computers, whatever it is. So he was a voracious reader and had the books to read. be our assistant before this is all over.
Ben would be a great assistant.
He would. The most interesting about him, let me just do one more slide, we'll wrap it up, but the most interesting about him, let me see. Alright, he traveled broadly, his first writings were unsuccessful. He was influenced by Shelley, he read all of his works. He was fascinated by the Renaissance. His characters were grand and troubled. He wrote dramas, dramatic poems, and monologues, concerned with the role of artists in society. And his greatest work, The Ring in the Book. We're going to read two poems by him, one really short, it's a love poem that doesn't contain the word love in it. And he wrote a poem called My Last Duchess, which is one of the most famous poems in literature. And you'll find it fascinating. So when we meet on Wednesday, you have the vocabulary, we'll quiz on Friday. We'll read at least 10 more pages. Watch out. That's not going yet. Yeah, please. Hi, Jamie.
Oh, I'm ready.
Oh, that's good. How are you gonna die?
So you know, we're coming here.
Can you open it in the car?
Trying to is like
Video. How do you change that?
tape. But IEDs, what you still look at like, in the next one, it's right here. Or you could, take like 8 different brain cells and then down a bunch of brain cells.
I think
Oh, you don't wanna go out with a bang, alright.
yeah, see you later. So, that's something I never, I didn't do that.
Thank you.
It always takes more than you think.
It definitely was.
So when do y'all play? You got a bind in a game?
Yes, so we play on Thursday.
Here.
Yes. Well, yeah.
What's, you know what the weather's supposed to look like?
Hopefully it's good, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, we have a pretty easy spring. We haven't had rain
Yeah.
out.
We have really, it's like the first.
Which is
time it's
unusual.
rained.
I know.
Yeah. Usually like April, it rains a lot, but.
Yeah, seasons are so short, maybe it's my perspective, does it seem short to you?
Yes.
Like you just got started and now?
And yeah, I feel like spring sports are shorter than like winter sports.
Well, they seem to last forever, you know, you start in November or
Yeah, and go
October
all-
even.
Yeah, and go all the way to February.
And you have to be ready during, Christmas holidays.
Yeah.
Anyway, see ya.
See ya.
Have a good one.